1943 reunion of the Mount Independence class of 1776-77. So, you know, the museum has a lot of artifacts in it, and most of them are anonymous. Some have names attached to them. And over the years, we've been doing presentations on various specific people who were here at the Mount. And then once we did, the last one we did, people asked, well, what happened to those people afterwards? Or what was their role when they were here, and what happened to them afterwards? So we have on your program, there's a list of the characters, and I'm sorry I made a Google on the name of one of them. So the first name, so that person who's talking about it will correct that. But we're just going to offer a snapshot of some of the many thousands and thousands of people who were here at Mount Independence from its course of its Revolutionary War history. So short snapshots, and then we'll keep doing longer programs of them in the future. And then in the background, we're going to have just some images as we go. And we're going to try to be clever about this, and people are just going to do their thing without us prompting them. So anyway, here we go.
John Trumbull was born on June 6, 1756, in Lebanon, Connecticut. He was the son of Jonathan Trumbull, who was the governor of Connecticut. He graduated from Harvard in 1773 and worked for a while as a teacher. When the Revolution started, he joined the local militia. But by 1776, he was appointed lieutenant colonel and adjutant for Major General Horatio Gates. He was asked to survey the land here at Ticonderoga, which became Mount Independence here. He said, I found it finely adapted for a military post. I drew a map proposing military defenses and locations for 3 regiments and presented this to Chief Engineer, Colonel Jonathan Baldwin. A fellow engineer, Thaddeus Kosciuszko, and I warned General Gates and his staff that Sugar Hill, later becoming Mount Defiance, needed to be fortified to protect the forts on both sides of the lake. We even demonstrated this by firing cannon toward the top of Mount Defiance. However, generals don't listen to colonels, and over our advice, it was ignored. And we know how that turned out in July of 1777. Trumbull left the Army after the 1777 campaign and eventually went to Europe to study painting. He was briefly imprisoned there because he was from the colonies, but eventually he got to study under Benjamin West. In 1784, at West's suggestion and the encouragement of his close friend Thomas Jefferson, he began a series of historic paintings based on the American Revolution. He also got to serve as secretary to John Jay while he was the diplomat in Europe, and he constantly moved back and forth between Europe and the United States. From 1815 to 1837, he ran a rather unsuccessful studio in New York City. But in 1817, he was commissioned by Congress to paint 4 large pictures for the Rotunda of the United States. They were 12 by 18 feet, so these were no small paintings here. They showed General George Washington resigning his commission, the surrender of Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown, the surrender of General Burgoyne at Saratoga, and his most famous, the Declaration of Independence. Now, this series was completed in 1824. Fortunately, going to modern day, none of these were damaged during the riots of January 6th. In 1831, Benjamin Silliman, who was a professor at Yale, established the Trumbull Gallery at Yale. It was the first art gallery at an educational institution in the United States. Trumbull died on November 10, 1843, at the age of 87 in New York City.
Mark, do you mind if I add one thing?
So
Trumbull had one only good vision and one
one
eye.
eye from a early childhood hunting
Right,
accident,
so
yes.
he did all that painting with just one good eye. Okay. So I'm talking about Jonathan Baldwin, the colonel. You've heard about him already several times today. We are lucky to have one of his descendants, Robert Saunders, right there. Trumbull has been called by uncharitable history writers as the incompetent engineer, but that's far from true. He was a self-taught engineer. And look at all the things he accomplished at Mount Independence. He didn't have the formal training of Kosciuszko, but the amount of work that he got done here was fantastic. And he wasn't a young man, he was 44 years old when he was first stationed here. And he was, well, in those days, that was not no spring chicken. And he was constantly at work. And one of his famous, I thought I had it right here. Here it is. This morning I visited all the artificers before breakfast as usual. I paid Esquire Gilliland $212 for carpenter's tools, as there is no quartermaster general. At present with the Army, I have that duty to do in part. And I have the entire direction of all the house and ship carpenters, the smiths, the armorers, the rope makers, the wheel and carriage makers, miners, turners, colliers, sawyers, and shingle makers, which are altogether 286, besides the direction of all the fatiguing parties, so that I have my hands and minds constantly employed night and day, except when I am asleep, and then sometimes I dream. That's probably his most famous quote, but his other famous quote is, where is it? Here. He woke up one day to find, or he came back to his tent to find that a lot of his stuff was stolen. And this really got him aggravated. He wrote, "This day I wrote to General Sullivan to remind him of the request I had made of a discharge, as I am heartily tired of this retreating, ragged, starved, lousy, thievish, pocky army in this unhealthy country." But he didn't actually resign from the army. In fact, he served another 4 or 5 years to, I think, to 1781. And then he only lived 7 years longer after that, which is unfortunate. You can see that it's his grave there. What's really poignant about his grave is that those 3 other smaller stones, those are all his children who died before he did. And he did have two children that did survive. You know, it was a sad time. It spoke a lot to the harshness of life back then.
Whereabouts is that cemetery?
In North Brookfield, Massachusetts. Yep. And then just one thing about him that I want to mention is that he, at the end of the Battle of Saratoga, when Burgoyne surrendered, he wrote a little note to General Sinclair, who had been really badly ridiculed for retreating from Mount Independence, and his reputation was very tarnished. Baldwin took the time to write this short note to Schuyler. "Give me leave to congratulate you on the important conquest over General Burgoyne and his army. A more complete victory you could not wish for, and I believe by this time the people in general have altered their sentiments with respect to the evacuation of Ticonderoga. The officers and all who I now hear speak about it say that a better plan could not have been adopted, and nothing but your leaving that place could have given us this success." And then he apologizes for the shortness of his note. And you can find this, I found this note among Sinclair, two big volumes of Sinclair's papers. And it's tucked in with all these other big, long, important notes, but it obviously was something that meant a lot to Sinclair and why he saved it and why it came down to us today. So anyway, Baldwin, we owe Baldwin thanks for two things. He gave us Mount Independence in two ways. One, he built it practically, and two, he kept his journal, which told us what happened there and when it happened. So those are two things for which we can be eternally grateful to Jed Baldwin. Thank you.
Steve, you mind if I add something to that too?
Yes, please.
I think I found his coping mechanism when I was looking through his diaries, and there was an excerpt in there that sometime in October, can't remember the exact date, that he ordered 30 cases of Madeira. 2 weeks later, he ordered another 30 cases.
Well, that's true, and I'm sorry if I keep going a little longer, but he was the last to leave Mount Independence when they were evacuating. And he was,
Madeira, probably.
well, he was using it to bribe the bateausmen to take his stuff. And just about the time they were taking off, the British came over the hill and started shooting at him, and he took off on his horse.
Brigadier General Anthony Wayne. He was born near Paoli, Pennsylvania, on January 1st, 1745. That's an important date to remember as we go on with it a little bit. He's going to lead the retreat from Quebec after the defeat of Arnold and the forces of Quebec City. And he's going to take over Sinclair, who from what I read had stubbed his toe and couldn't lead them any longer. And Wayne had been wounded slightly, so he's going to be in charge of this force coming down. When he gets down here, he's going to take over command of the garrison after Gates is relieved and moved away. So roughly from November until April, Wayne is going to be in command of the garrison. The big knock against Wayne is that he mollycoddled what he would call the middle colony troops, which were troops from Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And from what I figured out, he didn't like the New England troops because he said they were too much argumentative amongst themselves about democracy. And they called their officers by their first names. So it wasn't, hey, Bill, I'm going to know this. No, you're not, do this. But anyway, he's going to be commander. When he is recalled, he is promoted to brigadier general. He will be going down and he will fight along Washington's army with the campaign against Philadelphia in the summer of 1777, 76, 77. And he's going to be instrumental in the final retreat of Washington's army from the Brandywine battlefield. He will be attacked by a British combined force of grenadiers and light infantry at what we call the Massacre of Paoli, where their officers, British officers, ordered them to just fix bayonets, take the flints out of their muskets, and they went in just with bayonets, overran the picket guard, and slaughtered about 45 to 50 of Wayne's men. It was called the Paoli Massacre. What's left of his regiment will fight against the British at Germantown near Philadelphia before the British take over Philadelphia completely. At Stony Point, 2 years later, he's going to do the same thing to the British. He's going to lead a bayonet attack against a British unit and do exactly the same thing that they did to him. The interesting point about him is after the Revolution, he is sent to a place called Fallen Timbers in what is now Ohio, where he defeats a group of Native American, a coalition of Native American troops, and will be responsible for putting together something that was known as the Treaty of Grenville, which more or less settled the Ohio Territory for a short period of time. It is now under litigation, I think. The Wayne National Forest in Ohio is being challenged to change the name to, I forget what they want to do. Anybody know what the name is? Okay, it is on that. Okay. So we'll see if that comes through or not. But what I found most interesting about Wayne is the fact that he is buried in 2 different places. Okay. And just before I do that, Fort Wayne in Ohio, in Indiana is named for him. Wayne, Pennsylvania is named for him, small town near Philadelphia. And he was buried in 2 places. He died in 1796 in Erie, Pennsylvania. And he was interred in a blockhouse at a fort there at Presque Isle. And If you know Pennsylvania, Route 322 runs from Erie all the way down to Philadelphia. It slices right across the state. So in 1809, his family and his son decided they would disinter him and move him closer to the home burial ground. When they dug him up, they were surprised that his body had not putrefied hardly at all. The carcass was just as though he was just passed away. So they decided to boil him to get the flesh off the bones. So his flesh is buried in Erie. His son put the bones in a wagon, and the wagon went down 322, which is now Route 322. And on the way down that 200, 300 mile, whatever it is, slice, they lost some of the bones. So Wayne is missing, I think it's his left femur and his right radius and bone and a couple other little ones. And on New Year's Eve, his ghost rides down 322 looking for the bones.
Matt Anthony Wayne comes from?
The Matt Anthony, I didn't mention that. There's a couple that one was supposedly has given him the name Matt Anthony by a drunken battling soldier on the way back from Quebec retreat. And the other was he had a spy of his flogged for misleading information or something. And the guy said to him, well, if you have me flogged, you're mad. He had him flogged. So the name stuck.
Wayne County, Michigan is Detroit, and that's also named after.
Okay.
At
There's
one
Wayne
point,
County,
that was-
Pennsylvania too, but yeah.
That was almost half of Michigan was Wayne County.
Okay. Yeah. So we got around it. Name wise.
Literally.
My name is John Greenwood. I was born in Boston in 1760. My closest friend was killed in the Boston Massacre, and I witnessed the Boston Tea Party. Following the Battle of Lexington in 1775, I determined to join the fight against the British. The sight of wounded and defeated soldiers retreating from Bunker Hill at first discouraged me from my purpose. But my resolve was restored when I encountered a wounded Negro soldier who planned to rejoin the struggle as soon as his injuries mended, and I enlisted as a fifer in the 26th Massachusetts Regiment. In 1776, I participated in the ill-fated expedition to Montreal. On the retreat down Lake Champlain, to cheer the men, I would often play them a tune. We eventually encamped at Mount Independence amidst thickly wooded and rocky terrain, filled with snakes of every description. Had it been filled with devils, however, it would have made no difference to our soldiers, for they were proof against everything. On October 11th, our Mosquito fleet of 13 vessels under Brigadier General Benedict Arnold gave battle to a considerable British naval force, but was overpowered and obliged to retreat. While stationed at Mount Independence, many of our soldiers got the flux and died like rotten sheep, so that out of the 500 men in our regiment, but 100 were left when orders came in late November for marching to Albany. I had the fever and ague, and what I suffered on the march, with no tents to shelter us from the snow and rain, cannot be described. In December, we were at McKinley's Ferry in Pennsylvania, and on Christmas night, amidst frigid temperatures, hurricane-force winds, heavy rain and hail, we accompanied General George Washington across the icy Delaware River, and on the subsequent 9-mile march to Trenton, where we surprised and overwhelmed the Hessian garrison. Following the war, I took up dentistry and became the favorite dentist of President George Washington, making several sets of dentures for him out of human teeth and other sources of ivory, including hippopotamus tusk. I retired in 1812 and died on November 16, 1819.
Yeah, Marcy, you can use it.
I can use that.
All right, I apologize. I had to brush up on reminding myself about Justice Sherwood. I did lots of research 2 years ago for a course, and then I've been thinking about him a lot in the last 48 hours, trying to remember everything. So Justice Sherwood was born in March of 1747 in Newtown, Connecticut. In 1772, he bought his first piece of land from the New Hampshire grants in Sunderland, Vermont. He then married Sarah Bottom, and her family was kind of in that same area as well. And sort of in that period of time that they were there, He also befriended many other people who, like the Green Mountain Boys, the Allen brothers, he was friendly with. He also would have certainly been involved in some of the exciting things that they had going on that they quote unquote called wolf hunts, trying to get Yorkers out of the area. He, in 1774, moved up to New Haven. And if you notice, this is the application for his property, which is the Bottom Farm, is what it's called. In New Haven, it's on, do they consider it North Street?
North Street.
I think it's North Street, yeah, North Street in New Haven. So if you, basically, if you turn by Beeman Elementary School and go down a couple of miles, it's on the left. It's a beautiful farm. So 1774, he would have been moved there. He would have really been involved in trying to get the town of New Haven, he was the town clerk, initially very civic-minded at that period of time, but he still felt like he was still loyal to the crown. So this really was very torn. I really enjoyed researching him because it really put a personal touch on what it must have felt like to have wanted things like the New Hampshire Grants and Vermont to become Vermont, but also, you know, where your loyalty lies in terms of the actual American Revolution. And this really played out and affected him for the rest of his life and his family and descendants. So in 1776, he was actually arrested as a loyalist, and he was sent to the Simsbury mines in Connecticut. Fortunately, he escaped. He quickly went back to Sunderland, where his wife and children would have been with his in-laws. He was smart enough or savvy enough to have to actually sign over his New Haven property to his brother-in-law, and then went to Crown Point to join Carleton there. He joined into the Queen's Loyal Rangers, and he was under Colonel John Peters. During this period of time also, he was doing a lot of scouting and intelligence work, so he really was already, you know, familiar with the area. In 1777, he would have been, he actually met up with William Twiss because of some of the scouting that he had already done around Ticonderoga, that area, and he actually went up to Sugar Hill, I've heard Sugar Hill and Sugarloaf Mountain, so Mount Defiance. So he was the one that supposedly showed William Twiss the location and how he got up, and then Twiss had decided that, what's the goat? I don't know that if a goat can climb up here, we can get, someone might know what the actual.
A man can go, where a man can go, we can drag a gun.
You could, yes, exactly. So then, you know, he continued doing a lot of the scouting missions in the area. The Battle of Hubbardton, so he missed the actual battle. It said that he took a couple of captives along Pittsburgh Ridge. So if I was remembering correctly, and I didn't have a chance to check and make sure, I think initially he had actually been with Baron von Riedisel, and then at some point split off as Hubbardton, things were heading towards Hubbardton, and that was when he went, he was further on the Pittsburgh Ridge area. So he actually made it to Hubbardton after all of the excitement had already happened. In terms of, he was at the Battle of Bennington. He was one of only a few of his unit to actually survive that battle. He was at the Battle at Saratoga. He was taken prisoner during that battle, but then was exchanged. He then continued to be in the Secret Service. He was kind of chief of intelligence and stationed out of the Royal Blockhouse that I think was Ile-aux-Noix, as well as he was in St. John's with his family as well for 3 years. And then he, between 1780 and 1783, while also being the commissioner for the prisoners and refugees, for the crown, he also would have been under Haldimand. So he was very involved with the negotiations with the Allens to try to see their last-ditch effort about whether they could talk them into having Vermont join Canada during that period of time and continue. And so he actually met down in Castleton with the Allens, kind of under the guise of talking prisoner exchanges, but also sort of had these secret negotiations talking about, what's the possibility. I think it was very Justice knowing both of the Allens for a long time. Previously, I think he knew them well enough to know that the reality of really stringing along the British to see how statehood was going to play out. So I think he was realistic in the sense that hopeful, I'm sure, to be able to get his own property and the spot that he loved in Vermont, but also realistic knowing that the likelihood that Vermont was going to decide to do that was unlikely. So with his position as the Commissioner of Prisoners and Refugees, he actually was very involved with doing the scouting in like the Gaspé region, even into New Brunswick, and then further west, kind of along the St. Lawrence, to try to find resettlement locations for all the loyalists that ended up having to head north. His own family ended up in Augusta Township, and he was very involved in a lot of the surveying, land, all of the kind of settlement of these areas. He also has property there, which is now in Prescott, Ontario. He was involved in lumber trade. He also had a grist mill. And then he passed away in 1798. He actually was on the St. Lawrence by Trois Rivières, and he fell off of the raft that they were hauling things on, but it's believed that he actually probably had a heart event because they said it was unlikely that he was so agile on rafts that it was unlikely that he would have stumbled or anything, that it probably really was some other medical issue that happened. I think that's
I'm going to tell you a story that you've heard many times before, but never told this way. In mid-November 1776, the remnants of 4 New England regiments, about 500 men who had fortified Mount Independence, crossed the floating bridge to Ticonderoga, sailed the length of Lake George, and marched to Albany. There they boarded Hudson River sloops for Kingston, New York. They were being sent to join George Washington, who was somewhere in headlong retreat across New Jersey. From the Hudson River, they marched 60 miles across the watershed to the Delaware River. Some men had to wrap their shoes in rags to keep their feet from the frozen ground. In northern New Jersey, they were caught in an early season snowstorm. Then they marched another 65 miles south before they crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. By then, all of Washington's army was on the Pennsylvania side of the river. Washington, of course, had plans. He had ordered General William Maxwell of New Jersey, who was one of the last voices we heard in the last presentation. He had ordered General Maxwell, another man from Mount Independence, to collect all boats on the New Jersey side of the river so the British could not cross, and to confiscate sturdy Doran boats used as cargo vessels so the American army could. On Christmas night, the Mount Independence troops made up about a fifth of Washington's force. In popular memory, Washington crossing the Delaware and winning the Battle of Trenton was the pivotal event of the Revolutionary War. The men from Mount Independence played the most important part. General John Sullivan observed, General Washington made no scruple to say publicly that the remains of the Eastern regiments were the strength of his army, though their numbers were comparatively speaking small. Believe me, sir, the Yankees took Trenton before the other troops knew anything of the matter more than there was an engagement.
I'm going to tell you a story about David Rusko. And he was born perhaps in Huntington, Long Island in 1754. His family and a number of other families who were more sympathetic to the American cause had to leave Long Island when the British arrived because it was untenable to live there. So a lot of them ended up in Litchfield County in northwestern Connecticut, as we heard, the home of the big bad Allen boys and other Green Mountain boys. And on February 1st in 1776, he enlisted in Captain David Downs' company of Colonel Charles Burrell's Connecticut Regiment. And so they went north up to Canada. We've heard about the Canada venture before. And let's see here, May 19th, his unit, the Downs Company, were captured at the Battle of Cedars. And there was a book that just came out about this history a few years ago. And they were stripped of all their possessions, like clothing and everything. And so his company was released because General Arnold had some negotiations so that they would be released. So they made their way down here. So his group was in the first soldiers who were here at Mount Independence and then helped build it. And a number of the Connecticut Regiment people had powder horns, such as this one, and this is the star of our introduction to the exhibit here. You see it when you come in. And a lot of these Connecticut men have these Mount Independence horns. And if you look at it in person, you'll see his name, David Rusko, at the bottom. The records are a little unclear about when he may have left here. It was either in late November or so when they all went to join Washington and others. And he eventually was discharged on May 12, 1777 in Albany. And he and his wife lived in New York State for a while. And then in 1795, they moved to Moncton, Vermont. And he was a farmer and a very clever man, obviously. He was a joiner and a carpenter. And people thought highly of him. And so they felt that he was a very important person. And he unfortunately did not do so well financially toward the end of his life. And by that time, there were pensions that they could apply for those who needed it. And the first time he applied, his paperwork got lost, and so he had to try again, and then he got it. And so he is buried in Moncton, and I drive by him many times a week on my way to and from work, and I always think of him. I look at him and I give him a mental and sometimes a physical salute. And so he and other Revolutionary War veterans and their families were the solid foundations of many of our Vermont towns, shaping them in the lasting ways that we appreciate today. And his name got changed, as you can see, to Roscoe. And his family remains in the area. You probably all know some Roscoes. Somebody here knows I do. Anyway, and the daughter and son of one attendee today are Roscoe's direct descendants. So he was one of the people at a very circuitous route. And they're the ones who helped make our state what they are.
How many of you have driven down the Northway and gone toward Albany across the Twin Bridges? Hey, whose Twin Bridges are there? What's the name of the Twin Bridges?
New York Port Authority.
Well, close, yeah. Oh, they're named for Thaddeus Kosciuszko. And as Jefferson, who was his good friend, said, He was one of our great revolutionary worthies. His heroism in the field could only be equaled by his moderation and availability in private life. The soldiers idolized him for his bravery, and the officers respected him for the goodness of his heart and the greatness of his mind. And another said, a noble volunteer of the cause of liberty in the New World, and a fearless advocate for freedom of his native land in the Old. As we'll see, Thaddeus Kosciuszko was both a hero in the American Revolution and a hero in his native Poland. His birth date is not quite sure. They think around somewhere between 1746 and 1752. But he was born in Poland to a noble Catholic family. He fought in the first partition of Poland. Now, Poland at that time was a large area in Eastern Europe, but its neighbors, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, all wanted parts of the land. And so in 3 different cases, as we'll see, they all would attack and annex part of Poland. So he got his early military training in the First War in 1772, and when he was about 20 years old. In the summer of 1772, after the First Polish War, he decided to go to Paris to study military engineering. It was there that he probably met some of our diplomats that were trying to secure help, and he became really enthusiastic about the American Revolution. So he decided to come to America and volunteer for the cause. He presented himself to Congress in August of 1776, where they appointed him colonel of engineers and gave him a salary of $60 per month. Now, he met with General Washington, and supposedly, this is a little bit of hearsay, maybe not the way it went, but Washington asked him, what do you seek here? And he said, to fight for American independence. Washington said, what can you do? And Kosciuszko said, try me. Washington liked the young man and appointed him to his staff as a military engineer. He was truly trained in European military engineering. By the spring of 1777, he was stationed with the Northern Army under General Schuyler. He arrived at Ticonderoga and Mount Independence and was assigned as Colonel Baldwin's chief assistant. It was here, of course, that he would meet John Trumbull, our earlier friend here. He designed many of the fortifications here on Mount Independence, most important of which was the Southern Battery. Now, if you're familiar with the work here, the Southern Battery is distinctly different from Baldwin's earthwork batteries. This was constructed in stone and was significantly aligned for interlocking fields of fire. And this, of course, was very, very important for the European warfare and any attack. Of course, it never saw action as far as that goes. Following the evacuation, Kosciuszko stayed with the Northern Army. He would be stationed then with Saratoga, where he helped to, again, draw the American defensive fortifications, which led to the defeat of Burgoyne in October. Later in the war, he would also be assigned to West Point on the Hudson River. By 1780, however, he longed for combat command, and Washington sent him south, where he would fight under both General Gates and General Greene, and was noted for his bravery. On October 13, 1783, as the war was over, Congress appointed him as a general. He also, of course, would design most of the fortifications that later would become the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. And as Jefferson was the founder, or the president that authorized that in 1802, military engineering became the curriculum at West Point for the next century and a half. It wasn't until almost the 1950s where they finally changed the curriculum. It was always military engineering. And that's because Jefferson realized we needed men like Thaddeus Kosciuszko. He returned to Poland, where he fought again against the Russians in both the second and third participations of Poland in 1792 and 1794. After 1794, Poland disappeared from the map of Europe. It would not reappear as a country until 1919, after the Treaty of Versailles. So when Jefferson, again, honored Kosciuszko as a leader not only here, but Poland also honored him as a hero for his his fight for free Poland. He would die on 15 October 1817 at the age of 71.
I'd like to introduce you to Reverend William Emerson. Reverend William Emerson was born on May 31st, 1743 in Malden, Mass., the 12th of 13 children of the Reverend Joseph Emerson and his wife Mary Moody Emerson. Two of his brothers also entered the ministry. William Emerson entered Harvard College at the age of 14 and graduated at 18 in 1761. He first became a teacher, but soon decided to follow in his father's footsteps. Reverend Emerson was called to the pulpit in Concord in February 1765, barely a month before the Stamp Act, the first major crisis that led to separation of the American colonies from the mother country. From its passage, and through the tense years of the Townsend duties, the arrival of British troops in Boston, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, and the intolerable acts, Emerson was an enthusiastic patriot known for his inspirational sermons. He fired up his parishioners after each new atrocity committed by the British Parliament. Emerson never wavered in his firm belief that God was on the side of those who opposed the British tyranny, no small comfort to the townspeople who looked to religion for guidance and encouragement. In 1770, the good Reverend and wife Phoebe built a home called Old Manse next to North Bridge. Like many ministers, Emerson was not afraid of the consequences of events, even if it meant armed resistance. By the middle of March 1775, Emerson was encouraging the newly formed minute companies, "Arise, my injured countrymen, and plead even with the sword, the firelock, and the bayonet. Plead with your arms the birthright of Englishmen, the dearly purchased legacy left you by your never-to-be-forgotten ancestors." He also was appointed chaplain to the Provincial Congress, an illegal body of patriots meeting in Concord in defiance of the intolerable acts, which outlawed such unauthorized activity in the Bay Colony. By April 19, 1775, Emerson was ready for the events that unfolded in Concord and at North Bridge, a stone's throw from his home. He only wished for two things: that the patriotic forces did not fire first, and that if fired upon, they would not back down. He would not be disappointed. By his own account, he joined the Minutemen at the first alarm, 1 or 2 a.m., and was with them as they climbed the eminence north of town to watch the British troops approaching. Emerson also recorded his eyewitness accounts of the action at the North Bridge, leaving his exact whereabouts and actions unclear. Whatever he did, his spirit was certainly with the men of Concord and the adjacent towns as they approached North Bridge. His remaining months as Concord's minister, Reverend Emerson continued to immerse himself in the unfolding events, including Bunker Hill. He met on numerous occasions with General Washington and his troops in Cambridge, and was instrumental in moving Harvard College to Concord during the duration of the British occupation of Boston. In 1775, August, Reverend Emerson left Concord 9 days after the birth of his daughter Rebecca for Fort Ticonderoga, where he would join the Continental Army as chaplain. After a short time, Reverend Emerson contracted dysentery and was discharged and sent home. He never made it, dying on October 20th, 1776, at age 33 on his way back to Concord in Rutland, Vermont, at the home of its minister, Benajai Roots. He's buried in West Rutland, Vermont. He is acknowledged to be the first chaplain to the Continental Army and the first chaplain to die in service to the new country. Oh, and his grandson was Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Thank you.
A minor point.
I'm next going to tell you about Private Aaron Oliver. He was a Revolutionary War soldier from Temple, New Hampshire. In military records, he is recorded as a mulatto or black man, and he and fellow townsmen immediately answered the call to march to Cambridge, Massachusetts on April 19, 1775, as they got word, as Mike was just telling us, about the battles of Lexington and Concord and the real start of the American Revolution. He fought at the Battle of Bunker Hill and then joined the Northern Army based at the new Mount Independence and Fort Ticonderoga in July 1776. So like David Rusco, he helped build Mount Independence. And you can see from his record, he never hesitated to go when called or when he thought there was the need. So he was here all throughout, we think, the summer and winter of '76. And by 1777, he was in Colonel Alexander Scammell's regiment, who were from New Hampshire. With all the American forces, they withdrew from here on the night of July 5th and 6th, and he was in the American rear guard and fought at the Battle of Hubbardton on July 7th. There he was taken prisoner by the British. It's not quite clear where they took him, but they released him in 1778. And then he died on April 3rd. Family tradition has it that Oliver died because of starvation, because of the dire conditions of his captivity. And his name is on the Revolutionary War Monument in Temple, New Hampshire. So his service helped build Mount Independence, and then he gave ultimately his all at the Battle of Hubbardton, and then we know that that's the start of the turning point in the war to the north here in the Northern Campaign. And his descendants have given the Hubbardton battlefield a few of his personal possessions, which he would have carried in battle because, you know, if he couldn't park them anywhere because then he was taken prisoner immediately. And they are on display every year, and some of his descendants still keep in touch with us and actually come to visit the site. So upon his shoulders and others like him, our country gained its independence.
Can you all see the quote?
Yes.
I'm charmed by the quote. I'll just read it in case some people can't see it. We may safely pledge ourselves that we will tell our story in all its entirety, from the first to the last, without bringing one single blush to the cheek of any lady or gentleman who may honor us with the perusal of these pages. My story is, on July 4th, 1777, behind the British lines near Ticonderoga, camp follower Anna Anderson gave birth to a baby boy named Jamie. Anna's husband was Sergeant William Anderson, but Jamie's biological father was almost certainly General James Ingles Hamilton. You see the painting there by Sir Joshua Reynolds. General Hamilton is important for Mount Independence. He was commander here for more than a month before he rejoined Burgoyne. He commanded a brigade in the First Battle of Saratoga and was praised by Burgoyne for his activity and good conduct. Everyone in my little story, General Hamilton, Sergeant Anderson, Jamie, Anna, and a growing family were part of the Convention Army, the prisoners of war who were marched about the countryside. We can imagine Jamie in Anna's arms on the march to Boston. He was a toddler as the prisoners made their way to Virginia. He was nearly 6 when the last of the Convention Army left the final prisoner village near York, Pennsylvania. General Hamilton was unmarried and had no heir. Back in Scotland, he saw to Jamie's education, bought him a commission in the Royal North British Dragoons, the Scots Greys, adopted him, and insisted that the boy take his name. So there he is, Colonel James Inglis Hamilton, leading the charge of the Scots Greys at the Battle of Waterloo. He was killed, but the charge was the turning point. My initial source for this story was a book published in Scotland in 1865, as you see, old reminiscences of Glasgow and the west of Scotland. When I first read the account, I suspected it was all Victorian nonsense. But author Peter Mackenzie got his details from Jamie's sisters. And when I checked dates and places, they turned out to be surprisingly accurate. A baby born into Burgoyne's army died as a great hero at Waterloo. It's charming that Mackenzie did not want to embarrass the ladies or faint-hearted gentlemen by explaining the scandalous details of Jamie's parentage, but I think everyone understood.
Just a quick question before we get into this. What's a mercenary?
Hired soldier.
Say it again?
Hired soldier?
Hired soldier? Okay. Any others? We refer to these German troops that were here as mercenaries? We refer to the as Hessians? Okay, in reality, there were more than one principality that sent German troops here.
Yes.
It was Hesse-Hanna. What's the other one? Hesse-Kassel, Hesse-Hanna, Waldeck, Beirut, Anhalt-Zerbst, and there's one more I'm missing. Braunschweig, yeah, that's what we're talking about, Braunschweig. So I discovered a guy from Braunschweig. He wasn't from Braunschweig, but he was here. We might have been here, but he was here in North America. This is going to be a made-up group, but what this guy says is that he was a poet. He went back to Germany after this, and he was a poet. But on his way back from university, he was shedding money. He was stopped going through Brunswick by a group of recruiters. They tore up his diploma. They put him in the unit. And this is what I wrote down. I'm not going to read everything that I have here, but this, I wanted to get this. This is the people in his unit. You tell me if these guys are mercenaries. The Bayard, son of a wealthy banker, a bankrupt merchant from Vienna, a haberdasher from Hanover, a dismissed postal clerk from Gotha, a monk from Würzburg, a sergeant of the Prussian Hussars, and a discharged Hessian major. He said it made up for interesting discussions, which I would imagine it would. And what he's talking about is coming here, not of his, he didn't want to be a soldier. He's not a Brunswicker, but he was in the Braunschweig unit. And he's sent over now, whether again, a gentleman whose name was Johann Gottlieb Soma, whether he actually was here or not, I don't know. But he talks about the reasons that many of these guys, some who did enlist, did it purposely so they could come here and desert. Others because they wanted adventure and see the world. And then he gets into traveling here, where he said there was 900 to 1,000 of them on the ship. And by the time they got here, 300 to 400 of them were sick. Now this is like a 6-week journey. 30 to 40 of them have died, and the rest of them were unleashed upon the populace. Now we lump them all together as Hessians. We call them brutal murderers, whether they were or not. This guy's a poet. I doubt if he had the heart to be a brutal murderer. He also talks about, what I found interesting too, that women, almost every soldier that was married wanted their wives to come along. So now it gets to the point where the Hessians or the Germans can't get enough transports for the men because all the women are on, and they have to start limiting the women. And it's literally like hundreds and hundreds of women that wanted to come here with the troops. So why are they coming here? Obviously, they don't want to go home. So I don't know how, I knew a gentleman who was considerably older than I am, that we were friends with, whose last name was Diefendorf, and he could trace his lineage back to the German soldier that served in the home. So, you know, there's a lot of them around. But we welcome as mercenaries, but truly, were they all mercenaries in that particular case? So guys in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's all I have on him, but yeah, go ahead.
One of the interesting ones, one book that I was reading there, he came over, his name was Kustad, Kustard, and his great-grandson was George Custer.
Yeah.
That stayed here after the war.
Was there not a debt that Germany was paying to Britain?
No.
And the troops were part of that?
Not really, no. George I was from Hanover when Queen Anne died. She had no heirs. George I was as close as they could get.
Protestant there.
Yeah, again, Protestant. And the House of Hanover, George I, George II, George III. George III is the grandson, great-grandson of George I. And the royal family, who is still in Hanover, changed their name to Windsor in World War I. Was it German?
Oh,
Yeah. So, but there were more than one principalities, and they're all related to George the First, Second, and Third. And they were asked to promote our troops because they're related. And the princes got the money, you know, return blood money. If they sent troops over, if the troop was wounded or killed, the prince got money. Now, these guys got paid, but they just got the regular soldier pay. They weren't getting a big bonus or anything. You know, so they were just regular soldiers. But again, a lot of them did come here because they wanted to.
And you can see from this German map, this actually is, it's that away on Mount Independence, so that the arrow points to where the Prince Friedrich Regiment was stationed, and then when we did archaeology here for the new Southern Battery Trail, we found that company, and that is from one of the German hut sites.
So Mike's going to take over. I have one question that, of all the people that we talked about, who do you think has made the most lasting impression on the United States? Okay. Trumbull has some great paintings. Okay. We talked about Wayne having placed his name against the patio, but I would argue it's Kosciuszko. One of the place you can find this.
So now Mike Barbieri has the thankless task of pulling this all together and telling us what he thinks about all these people.
Yeah, Elsa asked me to wrap it up. I'm going, okay. So what am I going to wrap up? So she goes, I don't know, you do okay. So, but anyways, the other challenge with it was that Steve said some stuff that I was going to say. Elsa said some stuff. Everybody said some stuff that I was going to say. So I'm going to kind of ad-lib a little bit, but a couple of tangents. First off, talking about the Battle of the Cedars. Good book on it, Mark Anderson is the guy's name. Published it 2 years ago or 3 years ago. Mark Anderson, he's from New Hampshire. Really good book on the Cedars. And secondly, talking about the Germans, Friederike Baer just published a book on the Germans. And it's an excellent book. I've just kind of skimmed through it. I talked to her quite a bit a couple of 3 weeks ago at a Thai convention thing seminar. And the book is good. She knows what she's doing. So that's another one that you might want to look into. It's all about the Germans. I can't exactly think of the title of it right now, but Friederike Baer, P-A-E-R.
We tried to get her to come and talk at this event.
Yes, and she couldn't make it.
Right.
She was actually, she's doing research now on Burgoyne's Convention Army. That's her current project. But she's interested in coming here and talking to her, because I asked her about that too. But anyways, you know, in talking about all these people and all the events we've gone through today, you know, we're dealing with Mount Independence. And there's a few things about the stories that we've heard today that I just want to touch on, just kind of expand on a little bit, maybe. You tend to think of the people that came here, the soldiers that came here. You know, you think of, oh, it's a rabble, it's untrained army. Stop and think about it. Those guys that came here in '76 had been in Canada for a year. A bunch of those guys had been in Canada for a year. They'd seen, if not combat, they'd seen some pretty nasty service. And yet they were still in the Army, and they hung on. So these guys that were sitting here in '76 at the start of when they first came here, those guys were soldiers with a capital S, not all capital letters. Those guys were hard soldiers. They were fighters. So it's not like this was a bunch of ragtag militia in here. You know, maybe later on, some less than desirables came up, but that basis army was some pretty tough guys. And they showed it at Hubbardton, they showed it at Fort Anne, the Battle of Fort Anne, and they ultimately showed it at Saratoga. So there's some tough guys, and some of them went down to Trenton. So don't discount these guys. Don't think that they are, you know, that they're just, you know, that traditional image of militia kind of sloppy and such. No. They may not have been trained fully well. They may not have been equipped and supplied as well as they could be. They were still soldiers, but like I said, a capital S. The Battle of Valcour, we talked about extensively earlier. For those of you that don't realize it, the American fleet took a hell of a beating on the 11th. They got out of there by skirting the British line. The British ships put a line across the mouth of the Valcour Harbor, but they left a gap between the end of their line and the New York shore, and the American fleet was able to get out through that way. Some folks have said there was fog that night. There was no fog. There may have been fog here, but there was no fog at Valcour, because first off, they put a little lantern in the back of each boat so the boat behind them could see it. If there was fog, you ain't going to see that boat, that lantern. Well, there's no fog. There was a new moon. It was only a few hours off of a new moon. So it was a dark night. One of the ships that the Americans had sent out when the British fleet first came on, the Royal Savage, turned and went back to join the fleet, ran aground. The Brits captured that boat during the battle and set it ablaze. So imagine yourself sitting on some Brit gunboat in the middle of Lake Champlain, turned dark, you've been in a battle all day long, your head is just going, eeeeee! You know, you got 24-pounders, 12-pounders, cannons going off all around you, all day long. You can't hear squat. And the other thing that's happening, when you see a big fire, what's everybody do? Watch that fire. What do your eyeballs do? So you're watching that fire, you turn around and look towards the New York shore, you ain't gonna see squat. You're gonna see nothing. So they couldn't hear anything, they couldn't see anything. That helps the Americans get out. Didn't do them much good, only 4 or 5 boats got away, but, you know. And by the way, some of the folks mentioned seamen, and they were looking for sailors. They wanted sailors for these boats. Couldn't get them. Most of the 600 guys in this fleet, all but probably a couple hundred, were drafted out of the Army, and a couple of folks mentioned, you know, somebody said something like 33 guys from such and such a regiment joined the fleet as Marines. Oh, gee, thanks. You know, East on land, I could run away in a boat. Where are you going? Nowhere, down. But, so, you know, those were another tough bunch on that fleet. Ultimately, when the British fleet came along, they came down here, and it depends on who you talk to, whose books you read, whose documents you believe. There's anywhere from 9,000 to 15,000 guys here when the British fleet comes here after the Battle of Valcour Island. There's a 18th century guideline, and it says to defend a position, you need 1 man for every 4 feet of perimeter. Okay. So if you look at Ticonderoga and Mount Independence, it's about 5 miles of perimeter around Ty, around the lake, and then around Mount Independence. So, you know, 1 man for every 4 feet comes out to a few thousand guys. The Americans actually had those numbers. The Brits get here with roughly the same numbers. You know, 8,000 to 10,000 guys. The British fleet comes late in the season. Brits had accomplished what they wanted, which was control of the lake. That was the British objective. The primary objective was control of Lake Champlain. They had it now. They look at this position and they're going, huh, that's lots of people, lots of bayonets shining, lots of cannons. Another guideline, you need a minimum 2 to 1 odds in numbers to attack a defensive position. The Brits had nowhere near that. They were roughly equal. So the Brits just finally said, we got the lake now, we'll be back. Went back to Canada. But Mount I, which was, by that point, had some pretty decent defensive works built here. They had everybody know how a cannon is rated in the 18th century? You hear 3-pounder, 6-pounder, 12-pounder. That's the weight of an iron ball that it fires. They had a couple of 32-pounders down on the shoreline. That fires a 32-pound cannonball. Okay? And a range on that thing, 3 to 4 miles. Even a 3 or 6-pounder will go 1.5 to 2 miles. So, you know, here's a British fleet coming along. Got all these cannons mounted along the shore battery. There's redoubts over at Ticonderoga that's firing on them. They land some troops. They look around. They do some probing, attacking the lines. Warner's gets hit a couple of times. Warner's guys up on the French lines area. Brits just say, nope, going home, see ya, we'll be back next year. So, and which they did. At that point, though, the numbers weren't here in '77. As I said, several of those regiments, 4 or 5 regiments, went from here in the end of '76. Left here, went down and joined Washington. A bunch of the other ones went home. Went into what's called winter quarters. Not much fighting here in the wintertime. Even though it's easier to move on the ice than it is, you know, over them. So they went home or they went and joined the Army. Congress and most Americans didn't think anybody would be back. The Brits would be back in '77. Well, that was a mistake. And they came back, as you know. Burgoyne comes back and pushes us out of here. St. Clair, talking about Wayne. Who's Wayne? Yeah, talking about Wayne. He was, you know, senior Army guy in the American Army in 1790s, 91. Arthur St. Clair, recognize that name? Same guy that's here in '77, abandons the place. Arthur St. Clair is given an army in 1791. Go out into the Ohio Territory and destroy the Indians. Didn't happen. He had 1,200 guys, lost 900 of them, as well as women and kids who were traveling with the army. This is November the 4th of 1791. St. Clair career is over at that point. But in 77, abandoning here was probably the best choice he could have made. Those guys are still, it's a different army at that point, it's 3,000 to 4,000 guys. Again, depending on whose figures you believe. Some of those guys were still veteran soldiers. They were still fighters. Again, Hubbard and those, good soldiers. But here we back to the 1 man for every 4 feet of perimeter, 5 miles around. You need, quick calculation, 9,000 guys to defend the perimeter? He has 3. What you gonna do, right? One of the options was to retire back here. Pull all the forces out of Ticonderoga and defend them out. Okay, that reduces your perimeter. You now have interior lines where I can send, if the unit's here and I need them here, they can just go, interior lines, quick movement, to get around. Whereas the enemy has to go all the way around. So you've got interior lines, you now have a perimeter you can defend, but Twist, who was it that was talking about Twist going up? Yep. Remember what she was talking about? Going up on Mount Defiance? Sugar Hill? And finding a position up there? It's not that cannons were put up there. Cannons did get up there, but that's not the problem. Brits can sit up there and just look down on Ticonderoga and Mount Independence. You've seen that picture taken from up on top of Mount Defiance? Beautiful view of Ticonderoga and Mount Independence. For Brit soldiers standing up there, you can see everything, every move. That's the problem in 77. So that's kind of why they get out of here. But 76 is the glory years. And all these people that were here in 76 on the American side, they had a successful experience here. They experienced the victory here. They've been beat up in Canada, but geez, they all got together here and a major British force came and withdrew. So those guys that left out of here in 76, they ended their service here on a positive note for the most part. Granted, supplies and food and shelter and this and all that. At least won a battle. So in my mind, these guys did a good job. And the Germans, when they came here, quick note on the Germans, mercenaries sell themselves. What did he say? The prince got paid by King George. And the prince said, you're going to North America. You didn't choose to go. You were told.
So thank you so much, Mike. So on that note,